right. Hello, everybody. It's March, and that's the month of the Irish. So you're watching this on Monday, March the 15th, and you're listening to Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation, and this is another episode of Mondays with Mundy. So thanks for rejoining, I hope, and if this is your first one, welcome aboard. Hope you enjoy it. With a name like Mundy, James got wishes, to be precise, I had to do something about the Irish, and why not? So let's see what I'm going to do. All right. So that means I have to share my screen. And by the way, did I mention I am the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation? If not, I sure hope well, now you know it. All right, here we go. All right, the League's first Irishman. All right. Many of them now, but back then there weren't very many at all because there weren't many Irish in Philadelphia at all back then either. Philadelphia didn't become a destination point for Irish immigrants really until the potato famine in the late 1840s. But there are always a few around. And so let's be introduced to one of the earlier ones. And here he is, Daniel Dougherty. He was born October the 15th of 1826 in Philadelphia. His father was Irish-born immigrant to Philadelphia. He was a land surveyor, which didn't pay a whole lot. So Daniel grew up in a fair amount of poverty. His mother died when he was maybe in his early teens, and his father remarried, but Daniel and his stepmother didn't get along. So Daniel did what a lot of kids do then and now. He hit the streets. And so Dougherty basically lived on his own. He was picking up odd jobs around the city, living in, sleeping in stables and whatnot and things like that. Probably never had even more than a high school education, if even that. It's unclear yet. I can't find any indication that even went through grade school, to be honest. But he had what we call a brain. And he also had imagination. And it's the early 1840s, he joined the Union Library Company with his meager earnings. So he was a reader. And that led to him making a very interesting decision. He decided to become a lawyer. So at the age of 18, in 1844, he went with the firm of William and Samuel Badger in Philadelphia. And for 5 years, he studied law under them. He interned for them. And this is the way one became a lawyer back then, all right? Much like you did an architect. You went to a lawyer's office, you read law, and you passed the bar. And that was it. And he passed the bar in 1849. So he's now a lawyer. But even before that, though, Dougherty was becoming quite a speaker. He was making political speeches as early as 1846 and 1847. So clearly that's another skill that he has, because he will become known as the greatest orator in the city, especially after the Civil War. So it's 1849. The Irish back then were mostly Democrats. The Democratic Party pretty much, I think, took control of the Irish and the Irish immigrants at that point in time. And so Dougherty was a Democrat politically. Right. 1850s, he establishing a very successful law practice in Philadelphia on the strength of having won a court case. His defendant was accused of murder, and Dougherty, through his oration, shall we say, to the jury acquitted this murder, if you will. And it was clear that the gentleman, most of the evidence was clear that the gentleman actually committed the murder, but Dougherty got him off with his elocution. So that reputation made Dougherty a very successful lawyer until in the 1840s. And then in the 1850s, voting Democratic, he voted for Buchanan in 1856. He voted for Stephen Douglas, the Little Giant, in the election of 1860. And of course, now in that election, there were 4 candidates running, 2 Democrats, and then, of course, a national unionist, John C. Bell, and then we had the Republican, Abraham Lincoln, who would win the election. So at that point, Dougherty is, not a Lincoln fan, to be honest. All right. So that kind of sets us up for what's about to happen. All right. So let's go see what did happen. All right. You may recognize these from before. I've shown them once upon a time. So the year was 1862, midterm, right, between the 2 presidential elections, in which case, as we've learned in modern elections, usually the party that controls the White House loses seats. And that's what happened in 1862. Pennsylvania became a Democratic state, though it kept the governorship. All right, New York became a Democratic state. Both the state and the city of New York were run by Democrats. And, you know, things weren't looking good in Philadelphia because Philadelphia had a Republican mayor, but the war wasn't going well. It was difficult even for Republicans to walk on the street without being heckled and hassled because of their political support of Abraham Lincoln in the war. And so, as you may remember, on November the 15th of 1862, a group of men got together at the home of Benjamin Gerhardt at 226 South 4th Street, and they called themselves the Union Club of Philadelphia, right? So they were going to become this patriotic social society that would support the Union, the Constitution, and Abraham Lincoln. But somehow Daniel Dougherty became part of this group, right? And they were avowedly Republican, right? Now, but Dougherty had shown some political independence. He disagreed entirely with Buchanan when Buchanan suggested that Kansas join the Union as a slave state. So Dougherty had a line in the sand that he wouldn't cross, and slavery apparently was part of it. All right. So here he is. He joins this Union Club in November of 1862, and he's surrounded by all of these Republicans. And then 7 meetings go by, 7 Saturdays, because they met on Saturday evenings at the home of the different members of the Union Club. And on December 27th of 1862, at the home of John Forsyth Meigs, 1208 Walnut Street. That night, they read Articles of Association, and that's what you see in front of you on the screen. So let me read it. The undersigned agreed to associate under the name of the Union League of Philadelphia and to adopt the following fundamental Articles of Association, to wit, number 1, the condition of membership shall be unqualified loyalty to the government of the United States and unwavering support of the Republican Party. And as soon as Dougherty heard that, springs up out of his chair. Not for me, not for me. I'm not for any Republican president. I am for my country. And after the room quieted down a little bit, Judge John Innes Clark Hare, one of the 2 founders of the Union League, and one of the great jurists in Philadelphia in the 19th century, basically said that, you know, if this was going to be just a political club or a social club, he would agree that it could be a Republican club. He said, but really, we have a larger issue than this. This is not our mission. Our mission is to be a patriotic society to support our country. And we need everybody, regardless of their politics, to join us to do this. And so Dougherty's sentiments won the day. And so the words Republican Club were cut out of the Articles of Association. And that was that. So Dougherty had, as you will, incredible influence at the very beginning of the League's history in December of 1862. And Dougherty would eventually sign, and what is what's on the Articles of Association? And you can see his name, left-hand column, 5th one down. All right, it just says Dan Dougherty. All right. So who would have thought that an Irish Catholic lawyer and orator would be responsible for the League's being basically an apolitical club? Technically, now granted, it was Republican in spirit. And that was fine because Dougherty himself would eventually catch that spirit, but not before he would give a talk on February the 23rd of 1863 at the dedication and opening of the League's first clubhouse at 1118 Chestnut Street, and that's what you see here. So Dougherty was one of a number of members who were asked to give some remarks, and this is what he said. I am no adherent of Abraham Lincoln. I opposed his election to the last. I would scorn to ask a favor of him and would not accept one if offered. I feel no partisan interest in the success of his administration. It has done many acts of which I do not approve, more, however, of omission than commission. But I deem it a duty, a holy duty, to take part in no organized opposition, but to do all I can to counsel, assist, and sustain the constituted authorities of my country in this war on this hideous and hell-born rebellion. So Dougherty's making it clear. The heck with politics. He is for his country. He is for the Union. And eventually, Dougherty would become one of the League's biggest Abraham Lincoln supporters. And ironically, perhaps, on the various marble steps that you see in this image, the League House, Abraham Lincoln visited the Union League on the night of June the 16th of 1864, after he had been at the Great Central Fair, the Sanitary Commission. held in the month of June in 1864. And Lincoln was invited to have dinner at the League. And Lincoln, who had somehow shaken his bodyguard, such as it was, arrived at the League unannounced. And so they weren't prepared for him at that point in time. But Dougherty was there. And Dougherty was asked to give a few remarks to Abraham Lincoln about Abraham Lincoln. And apparently, and unfortunately, I can't find the words. I don't think anybody really wrote it down. But if you know them, let me know. But apparently, Dougherty was incredibly encouraging, complimentary to Abraham Lincoln. And he would remain a fan of Abraham Lincoln's until Lincoln's assassination in 1865. So how do you like that? So you never know. Now, that doesn't mean that Dougherty never really left the Democratic Party, though he voted Republican in 1864, obviously. Right. So after the war, and this is Dougherty in 1876, right? Dougherty would just go back to his law practice in Philadelphia, and he stayed out of politics until the 1876 election, when James Tilden, the Democrat, was running against Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. And at that point, Dougherty supported Tilden. And that was his reentry into Democratic Party politics, because 4 years later, in 1880, in Cincinnati at the Democratic National Convention, he would give the nominating speech for Philadelphia native Winfield Scott Hancock, the general, the superb. Hancock would get the nomination based on Dougherty's nominating speech, but he would lose the election, James Garfield, and then Dougherty would also, in 1888, give the nominating speech for Grover Cleveland for his renomination, for his reelection as president in 1888. But again, but Cleveland lost that election to Benjamin Harrison. So Dougherty didn't have a good track record in his presidential nominations, but nonetheless, though. But Dougherty at this point is just now he's a very wealthy man. He lives at 2021 Spruce Street. All right. But if things happen with Dougherty, and it's hard to really tell because there's very little evidence of Dougherty after the Civil War. But let's see now, died in 1892. So in 1888, he would move to New York City and become part of the Tammany Hall Democratic Party. And that's what he did. But he was still coming back to Philadelphia because he still had family here. Actually, in 1853, he married Cecilia Higgins. Gillespie, rather, I'm sorry. And they had 6 children. So he had children in Philadelphia. And he was coming back, and property, coming back to visit. And so he was a visitor to Philadelphia. And it was in one of those visits in 1892 that he would become ill. And he would die eventually at his house on September the 5th of 1892. But in the meantime, Dougherty had become one of the most famous orators in the country, and especially Catholic orators, because he was, after all, an Irish Catholic. In 1891, let me see now, in 1889, he gave a talk that was considered his best one to the Roman Catholic Laymen's Congress in Baltimore. And then in 1891, the year before he died, the University of Notre Dame awarded him the Laetare Medal, which could only have been done with the consent of Pope Leo XIII. So when he died on September the 5th, the city went into mourning. His funeral was held at St. John the Evangelist Church. Well, that's his house at 2021 Spruce Street. That's where he died. All right. And this is St. John the Evangelist Church, which still exists on South 13th Street between Chestnut and Sansom. Right, actually just below Market, as I used to say. All right. And that was the interior of the church at the time of Dougherty's funeral. Okay. All right. The funeral mass was said by none other than the Archbishop of Philadelphia, Patrick Ryan. And there were no less than 12 priests on the altar. I mean, that doesn't happen for popes even. It goes to show you, though, how just what his reputation was in the city of Philadelphia. So he had become clearly one of the city's leading Irish Catholic laymen. So, and this is where he is today. He was buried right in the church cemetery. So if you go visit St. John the Evangelist right now on South 13th Street, on the north side of the church is a very small cemetery. And you can see this is the Daniel Dougherty family vault. He was predeceased by one of his sons, William, and there's Daniel II, his wife, Cecilia, and his son, actually, D. Webster Dougherty, became a very famous judge in Philadelphia, but who died in 1917. So that's our story. All right. So the League's first Irishman, if you will, and one of the great one in the city of Philadelphia in the 19th century. So I hope you enjoyed that. Hope you learned something new. And before we know it, St. Patty's Day will be over, and we'll all be happy for that. So thank you for watching. Let's shout out to the Legacy Foundation for sponsoring another episode of Mondays with Mundy. And in between, everybody, go out and get your vaccines. It's still a little rough out there, so stay well and stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.